Picture an old man in a plain brown coat. Philadelphia, summer of 1776. A hot room, bad air, his joints aching, and a table in front of him with a piece of paper on it. He knows exactly what that paper is. It isn't a declaration. It's a confession. Every man who puts his name on it is admitting, in his own handwriting, to treason against the most powerful empire on earth. If the war goes badly, that signature is a rope. He signs anyway. And here's the thing nobody stops to think about. He never planned any of this. He didn't grow up dreaming about revolution. He wanted to print books, sell almanacs, and rub glass tubes together to find out why a pointed piece of metal pulls fire out of the air. So how does a boy who left school at 10 end up as the face on a $100 bill? A boy who spent his childhood cutting wicks in a shop that stank of boiled animal fat. The 15th child of a soap maker. And he ends up drinking wine with the King of France. That's the next half hour. Not the marble statue, the actual man. The runaway, the liar, the schemer, the father who buried a 4-year-old and blamed himself for 54 years. The genius who carried a little notebook where he wrote down every single thing he did wrong that day. It starts in a 2-room house in Boston, January 1706. Boston is 7,000 people, wooden, cold, and deeply religious. In a rented house on Milk Street, Josiah Franklin's wife, Abiah, gives birth to his 15th child, the 10th boy. Read that again. 15th. Josiah made candles and soap out of rendered animal fat. If you've never smelled a tallow works, here's the closest I can get you. Imagine a kitchen where nobody has cleaned the grease trap since the Restoration. Now imagine living above it. That was the smell of Benjamin Franklin's childhood. There was never enough of anything in that house, but Josiah had one habit that shaped his son more than any school ever did. He invited interesting people to dinner, ministers, tradesmen, travelers, and at the table he steered the talk towards something useful, on purpose, so his children would pick up something worth knowing along with the boiled meat. Benjamin said later that he grew up so used to good conversation over food that he honestly could not remember what he'd eaten. The boy was strange the way clever children are strange. He read absurdly early. He organized the neighborhood kids and put himself in charge. One time, sick of sinking into the marsh while they fished, he led a nighttime raid on a pile of building stones and built himself a wharf. The workmen found the theft by morning. The fathers found the culprits by dinner, and Benjamin argued that the wharf was useful to everybody. His father told him, nothing dishonest is ever really useful. First time he tried to talk his way out of trouble with a clever principle. Not the last. He also loved water, and he loved kites, and one day it occurred to him those two things could be combined. So he waded into a pond holding a kite string, lay back, and let the wind tow him a mile across open water while his friends carried his clothes around the shore. Nobody had done that before. He just had a thought, and instead of enjoying the thought, he tested it. That reflex. What if I tried it and found out? That's the whole man, at 8 years old. Josiah looked at this child and made a decision. This one goes to Harvard. This one becomes a minister. So Benjamin went to Boston Latin, climbed from the middle of the class to the top in under a year, got promoted a grade ahead. And then his father pulled him out. 2 reasons, and both are honest. A Harvard education for a 15th child on a candlemaker's income was arithmetic that never worked. And the temperament was wrong. Josiah watched his son argue and noticed something. The boy didn't argue to learn. He argued to win. The clergy of Massachusetts wanted obedience above everything. Benjamin's factory setting was why. So the formal education of the most quoted American of the 18th century ended at 10 years old, and he went straight down the stairs into the tallow works to skim fat off the boiling kettles for his father. He hated it. Completely. The kind of hate that surprised even him, and that hatred did more to launch him than any teacher ever could. He started talking about running away to sea. Common escape for a Boston boy. terrifying for Josiah, who had already lost his son to a ship that never came home. So Josiah tried something else. He walked his son around the city. Joiners, bricklayers, coopers, cutlers. Days of it. The idea was to find a trade the boy could stand. What actually happened is that Benjamin quietly filed away how a dozen different crafts physically worked. Knowledge that would let him, decades later, design a better stove and a better street lamp because he understood how things get made. But the trade that took him was words. His older brother James had come back from London trained as a printer, with his own press, and in 1718, at 12 years old, Benjamin signed an indenture. 9 years of unpaid labor for his own brother, who could legally beat him. Sounds like a prison sentence. To Benjamin, it was a door, because in colonial America, a printer wasn't a laborer. A printer was the nervous system. They printed the newspapers, the sermons, the government proclamations, sometimes the money itself. They knew every merchant and every magistrate in town. A printer decided what a whole colony read on Monday morning. 12-year-old Benjamin understood that with unsettling clarity. He mastered the machine fast. Then he went after the thing the machine existed for. He wanted to write. Not adequately, beautifully. And nobody was going to teach him, so he built his own training program. And honestly, it's still a good one. You got hold of copies of The Spectator, the London magazine, the best English prose of that generation. He'd read an essay, take short notes, then wait several days until the wording had faded out of his head. Then he'd rebuild the whole thing from his notes in his own words. Then he'd lay his version next to the original and hunt for every single place where his was worse. Sometimes he'd turn the essays into bad verse and then back into prose, purely to force himself to find new words when the old ones wouldn't scan. Alone. At night. After 14-hour days. He went vegetarian partly on principle and partly because it was cheaper, and he pocketed the savings to buy more books. By 1722, James was publishing the New England Current, and it needed copy. And Benjamin knew exactly what would happen if he handed his brother an essay with his own name on it. 16-year-old apprentices did not write for the paper. It goes in the fire, and you get mocked for a month. So he lied. Beautifully. He disguised his handwriting. He invented a person, Silence Dogood, a middle-aged country widow with strong opinions, a dead husband, and zero patience for pretension. And one night, he slid the manuscript under the print shop door and went to bed. Next morning, he's standing at the typecase with his face carefully blank, while his brother and his brother's literary friends read it out loud, praise it, and argue about which distinguished gentleman of Boston must have written it. 14 do-good letters ran that year. The widow had opinions about drunkenness, about hoop skirts, about how women were treated, about religious hypocrisy. In one famous one, she took apart Harvard College as a place where rich boys mainly learned how to enter a room politely. Boston loved her. A couple of readers wrote in proposing marriage. The author was a teenager sweeping up in the back, and then he made the mistake of telling someone. James was humiliated in front of his own circle. Worse than that, he now knew his apprentice could outwrite him. That's where the brothers broke. And the crack got a lot wider a few weeks later, when James got himself arrested. The Current had been needling the Massachusetts authorities for months. A pirate ship was working the coast unmolested, and James printed a jab suggesting the government wasn't in any particular hurry to catch it. The assembly didn't laugh. They threw him in jail for a month. No trial. And who ran the newspaper those weeks? A 16-year-old. Who made it sharper than usual, ran material about the liberty of the press, while his brother sat in a cell, and enjoyed himself enormously. James came home to a shop that had run fine without him, and a younger brother with a reputation. They fought constantly after that, and it got physical. Benjamin said later the beatings probably gave him his lifelong hatred of arbitrary authority. He also admitted he was insufferable in an argument. Both things can be true. Then the authorities escalated. After a piece mocking religious hypocrisy, they banned James Franklin by name from publishing the Current at all. And the brothers found a loophole, a beautiful one. If James can't publish it, someone else will. Strike his name off the masthead. Put Benjamin's there instead. From that week on, legally, the paper belongs to the teenager. One problem. You can't be the publisher of record and be somebody's indentured servant at the same time. So James publicly canceled the indenture and privately made Benjamin sign a secret one covering the remaining years. Sit with that a second, because Benjamin certainly did. There is now a piece of paper binding him which his brother can never show to a magistrate, because producing it would prove they'd defrauded the government of Massachusetts. He'd been handed a key and told it was a chain. September 1723 года. 17 years old. He uses it. Sells some of his beloved books for passage money. Has a friend book the berth under a cover story about a girl in trouble, and slips out of Boston without telling his parents. New York first. The only printer in the city, an old man named William Bradford, has no work, but he gives him something better, a direction. My son runs a shop in Philadelphia. Go there. So he goes, part by boat, part on foot, soaked in a storm. Feverish, nearly drowned in a squall crossing to New Jersey, 50 miles on foot in the rain. And when he finally steps onto the Market Street wharf in Philadelphia, he is filthy, exhausted, and holding $1 Dutch and a shilling in copper. That's it. That's everything he owns. He buys 3 great puffy rolls of bread, more than he expected for the money, and having no bag, he walks up the street with one under each arm, eating the third. A girl standing in a doorway watches the scarecrow go past and laughs at him. Her name is Deborah Reed. 7 years later, he marries her. Bradford's son had no work either, but a strange, unstable printer named Samuel Keimer did. A man with a press, terrible equipment, and no real idea what he was doing. Within weeks, the 17-year-old runaway was the most competent printer in Pennsylvania. He should have been safe there. Instead, he was about to get taken apart by a man with a title. Philadelphia liked him right away. Funny, tireless, disconcertingly capable, and he had that rare gift of making older men feel clever in conversation. One of those older men was Sir William Keith, the royal governor of Pennsylvania. Keith starts inviting him out, dinners, taverns, long talks about the future of the colony. He tells Benjamin the existing printers are incompetent, the province needs a good one, and that he, personally, the governor, will set him up in business. 18 years old, still half ragged, and the king's representative is telling him he's going to be somebody. Of course he believed it. You would have believed it. The plan had steps. Sail to Boston, patch things up with the family, get his father to fund the press. He went, and he enjoyed it enormously, walking into his brother's shop in a new suit with a watch and a pocket full of silver, purely to be insufferable. James never forgave that one either. Josiah said no. Kindly. Absolutely. You don't hand an 18-year-old a business. Fine. The governor said he'd cover it himself. All Benjamin has to do is sail to London, pick out the presses personally, and come home to a shop of his own. Keith will send letters of credit aboard before the ship leaves. November 1724. Benjamin boards. He asks the captain for the governor's letters. They're in the general mail bag, he's told. I'll sort it at sea. Off the English coast, the bag is opened. Nothing. No credit. No letters of introduction. Nothing with his name on it anywhere. Keith had never sent a thing. He'd never intended to. As one of Keith's own friends told Benjamin flat out afterward, the man had no credit to give, so he handed out promises instead. They cost him nothing and made him feel generous. So there he is. Christmas, 1724. 18 years old, alone in the city of 600,000 people, no money, no contacts, and a return fare he can't afford. This is where most stories end. Kid gets used by a powerful man and disappears into the crowd. What he did instead is why we're still talking about him. He got a job. Immediately. A printing house in Bartholomew Close, then a bigger one near Lincoln's Inn Fields, one of the largest shops in London. And he noticed things. The other pressmen drank about 6 pints of strong beer a day, on the theory that beer made you strong. Benjamin drank water, ate cheap, and could carry 2 full forms of type up the stairs while men twice his size managed one. They called him the Water American. He noted, dryly, that they stayed poor because they spent their wages on the exact thing that was making them weak. London gave him 2 friendships, and they taught him opposite lessons. The first was James Ralph. Charming, talented, allergic to work. Convinced he was about to become a great poet, then a great actor, then a schoolmaster. Failed at each one while borrowing Benjamin's wages. When they finally fell out, Ralph announced the debt was canceled as punishment. Benjamin had lent him most of a year's savings. He filed it under errata, the printer's word for a mistake you'd correct in the next edition. That became his lifelong word for his own. The second man was Thomas Denham, a Quaker merchant, and Denham showed him what he actually wanted to be. Years before, Denham had gone bankrupt, settled with his creditors for pennies on the pound, and sailed to America to start over. Now he's prosperous and back in England, and he invites every single one of those old creditors to dinner. Good food, no speeches. And when the meal is done, he asks them to lift their plates. Under each one is a bank draft, the full remaining balance of what he owed them, with interest. Years later, when no law on earth could have made him pay a shilling of it. Benjamin was 20. He never forgot it. When Denham offered him a clerk's job in a Philadelphia store, he took it, and in July 1726 they sailed home. 80 days at sea, and somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic, watching flying fish and boredom, he sat down and wrote himself a plan for the rest of his life. 4 rules. Live frugally until every debt is paid. Tell the truth and quit promising things you can't deliver. Work hard, because there's no substitute, and everybody waiting for a windfall is fooling himself. And speak ill of no man. Say only the good you know. 4 sentences from a 20-year-old clerk. He kept them for 64 years. Around 1730, that plan grew into something bigger. He called it a bold and arduous project of arriving at moral perfection, which tells you everything about how seriously he took himself at that age. 13 virtues: temperance, silence, order, frugality, industry, sincerity, justice, on through tranquility. He made a little book with a page for each week and a grid of dots, and every single night he went down that list and marked a black dot for every fault of the day. Ate too much, talked too long, wasted an hour. And he was honest about how it went, which I love. Order beat him, completely, all his life. Keeping his papers and his time tidy was simply beyond him. He said that page got so covered in marks, he wore holes in it erasing them, and eventually he decided a speckled axe is best. A perfectly polished blade isn't worth what it costs to grind. And there was one virtue he'd missed entirely, until a Quaker friend took him aside and told him, gently, that he was widely regarded as proud, overbearing, insufferable when he happened to be right. So he added the 13th, humility. And underneath it, as the standard to aim at, he wrote 6 words: imitate Jesus and Socrates. No more, no less. He admitted he never mastered the substance of it. What he mastered was the appearance, and then found the appearance worked so well it turned into something like the real thing. He stopped saying certainly and undoubtedly. He started saying, I conceive, or if I am not mistaken, or it appears to me at present. He stopped contradicting people flatly, and he found, to his own surprise, that when he stopped trying to win arguments, he started winning them. Because nobody defends a position they weren't attacked for. That trick of the tongue would eventually be worth more to the United States than an army. Hold on to it. It comes back. But first, everything fell apart again. The job with Denham was perfect. Good pay, a mentor he admired, a clear road ahead. 4 months in, Both of them fell seriously ill. Franklin nearly died of pleurisy. He said afterward that he'd been rather disappointed to recover, since he'd already made his peace with dying and now had to do the whole business over again someday. Denham didn't recover. The store got sold off. 21 years old, back to nothing. Again. So he swallowed his pride and went back to Samuel Keimer. Not as a printer this time, hired as the manager, to train up Keimer's cheap, hopeless workers so that Keimer could then fire him. Franklin knew that was the plan, knew it going in, and took the job anyway, because it came with a press. And what he did with that press in those months is genuinely absurd. He cut and cast the first American-made type, because Keimer needed characters he couldn't import. He made his own ink. When New Jersey ordered a run of paper currency, Franklin built a copperplate press for it and designed an anti-counterfeiting trick using the print of an actual leaf, a pattern no forger could carve because no two leaves are alike. 22 years old, quietly better at this than anyone on the continent. And he opened his own shop, and it turned into a knife fight. Keimer panicked and launched a newspaper to block him. Franklin's response is my favorite thing he ever did as a young man. He anonymously wrote a series of wickedly funny letters in the rival Philadelphia paper, not his own, the other guy's. So popular, they pulled readers away from Keimer, while Franklin publicly had nothing to do with any of it. 9 months later, Keimer was finished and selling out cheap. October 1729. Franklin bought the paper off him and renamed it the Pennsylvania Gazette. 23 years old, he owns a press and a newspaper in the fastest-growing city in British America. And here's where he figures out the thing that makes him. Print doesn't give you military power. It doesn't give you legal power. It gives you something slower and much more durable. It lets you shape what people think is normal. He spent 30 years using that, usually without signing his name. He wrote as Martha Careful, as Celia Shortface. He wrote a fake trial report about a woman named Polly Baker, prosecuted for having children out of wedlock, whose courtroom speech demolished the double standards so well it got reprinted across Europe as a real case. It wasn't. He made her up, and people believed it for decades. Then in 1731, after readers threatened to cancel over something he'd run, he published his Apology for Printers. The argument goes like this. Printers deal in opinions the way an innkeeper deals in travelers. If they only printed what offended nobody, almost nothing would ever get printed. Let truth and error both take the field. Truth generally wins a fair fight. That's a defense of a free press written 45 years before there was a country to have one. People noticed. The Assembly started sending him government printing. The Freemasons brought him in, which put him in a room with every man of consequence in the province. By 25, the runaway apprentice was somebody. Which brings us back to that girl in the doorway. Deborah Reed had been close to him before he sailed for London, close enough that there was an understanding between them. Then he was gone 18 months and wrote to her, by his own count, exactly once, to say he probably wasn't coming back anytime soon. Her mother pushed her into marrying a potter named John Rogers. Rogers ran through her money, was rumored to already have a wife back in England, and fled to the West Indies to dodge his creditors. Which left Deborah in a legal trap with no exit. She can't divorce a man nobody can find. She can't remarry without proof he's dead, and there isn't any. And if she remarries, and Rogers turns up alive, she's a bigamist. That's a whipping offense. So in September 1730, they just started living as husband and wife, publicly. No license, common law. It lasted 44 years. Franklin, who blamed himself for the entire mess and put it on the list of the great errata of his life, called her a good and faithful helpmate. And then there's William. Around this same time, Franklin acknowledged an illegitimate son. Who the mother was, nobody has ever established. Franklin never said one word about it. Not then, not ever. What he did do was bring the boy home, and Deborah raised him. They had 2 children of their own. Sarah, born 1743, who'd outlive him and take care of him at the end. And Francis, born 1732. Now, Franklin was one of the loudest public voices in Philadelphia for smallpox inoculation. He printed the arguments for it. He believed in it completely. And when it came to his own 4-year-old son, he waited. The boy had a cold. He wanted him stronger first. Francis caught smallpox and died in November 1736. Franklin was never the same about it. For years afterward, he was still publicly correcting the rumor that the boy had died from an inoculation, because he was terrified other parents would use his son as an excuse not to protect theirs. Writing his autobiography more than 40 years later, An Old Man in France, he said he had long regretted it bitterly, and still did. And he told other parents flat out, "This is the regret you can't fix. Choose the safer risk. Some pages you don't get to reset." He buried his son, and then he did what he always did with pain, turned outward and built something. By then he had a theory about what to do with a life, and he'd come at it sideways. He was a deist. He figured the Creator built the machine and stepped back. So if God doesn't need your prayers, what's actually left to offer? One thing: be useful to other people. But being useful at scale needs organization. So back in 1727, at 21, he'd started a club. He called it the Leather Apron Club, after the aprons tradesmen wore. Everyone else called it the Junto. 12 members, deliberately not gentlemen. A surveyor, a shoemaker, a joiner, a glazier, Friday evenings. And the rules banned flat contradiction and positive assertion of opinion, with a small fine if you slipped. Because Franklin had learned in London that people stop listening the second they feel attacked. He wrote a standing list of questions to work through. Have you met anyone lately who's prospering, and how did they do it? Do you know a citizen who's recently done something worth praising? Do you know of any encroachment on the liberties of the people? Is there anything the Junto can do for mankind, for the country, for yourselves? That last question is the engine of the entire American voluntary sector, and it got invented by a handful of tradesmen in a tavern. Look what came out of that room. They all owned books, and none of them could afford all the books they wanted. So in 1731, they pooled their money and founded the Library Company of Philadelphia, first subscription library in America, a place where a working man who wasn't rich and wasn't a scholar could borrow serious books. It still exists. Philadelphia was a fire trap of wooden houses, and the response to a fire was a chaotic mob with buckets. Franklin wrote an anonymous piece about it in his own paper, then organized the Union Fire Company in 1736, trained volunteers, assigned roles, equipment kept ready. Other companies copied it within months. The streets were unpaved, so shops sat in mud. He wrote about it, raised subscriptions, got them paved, then swept, then lit. And he wasn't satisfied with the lamps London used, a single glass globe that filled with soot in hours and was ruined by one crack. So he redesigned them, 4 flat panes, so you replace one cheap pane instead of the whole globe, plus vents so the smoke goes up instead of blackening the glass. He founded an academy to teach practical subjects to boys who weren't going into the ministry. That became the University of Pennsylvania. He co-founded the first public hospital in the colonies using a move he basically invented on the spot. He got the assembly to promise matching funds if private donors put up an equal sum. Then he went to the donors and told them their money would be doubled. Both sides said yes to something neither would have funded alone. He was rather proud of that one, and he was allowed to be. One club, a library, a fire service, a hospital, a university, and paved lighted streets. But all of this was unpaid, and he had a family. So in 1732, he went looking for money, and he found it in the most boring product imaginable: almanacs. Every household bought one every year. Calendar, moon phases, tide tables, planting dates, weather guesses, dull, essential, and a guaranteed annual sale. Franklin's came out under the name Richard Saunders, a poor, henpecked astrologer whose wife was threatening to burn his instruments if he didn't start earning. Poor Richard's almanac. And into that empty space beside the dates, where other publishers put filler, he packed sayings. Sharpened, rhythm-tuned rewrites of old proverbs, plus plenty of his own. Early to bed and early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. 3 may keep a secret if 2 of them are dead. He that lies down with dogs shall rise up with fleas. There never was a good war or a bad peace. A small leak will sink a great ship. You said at least one of those this year without knowing whose mouth it came out of. He published it 25 straight years, around 10,000 copies a year in a colony of maybe 150,000 people. It made him genuinely wealthy, and wealth opens doors. In 1736, the Assembly made him its clerk. Dull job, good pay, and it put him in the room where the laws got made. A year later, postmaster of Philadelphia. Now think about what a colonial postmaster actually controls. He knows who writes to whom. He knows which news arrives and how fast. He can carry his own newspaper free while his rivals pay. In an age with no telegraph, the man who runs the mail runs the speed of information. So now he's got money, a press, a network, and the mail. May 1743, he puts them together and proposes an American Philosophical Society, a junto for the whole continent. Thinkers in every colony send their findings to him. He prints them and circulates them back out. Started slow, still going, and by 1748, at 42, he'd made enough to do something almost no successful man does. He stopped. He handed the printing house to his foreman on a partnership that paid him half the profits for 18 years without lifting a finger. And he retired. Not to rest, in his own words, to read, study, make experiments, and converse at large with such ingenious and worthy men as are pleased to honor him with their friendship. He had 42 years left to live, and the most famous thing he ever did hadn't happened yet. It started with a magic show. 1743, Boston. Franklin wanders into a demonstration by a Scottish showman doing the electrical parlor tricks that were touring Europe. Rub a glass tube with silk, suspend a boy on silk cords, charge him up, draw sparks off his hands and face while the crowd gasps. Franklin's own word for how he felt was surprised and pleased. He also thought the man's explanations were nonsense. A few years later, a London correspondent sent over a glass tube with instructions, and Franklin turned his house into a laboratory. He wrote that he had never in his life been so engrossed by any study. And in about 4 years, a retired printer with no schooling past the age of 10 rewrote the physics of electricity. Here's what everyone believed at the time. 2 different electrical fluids, produced by rubbing different materials. Messy. Complicated. Franklin proposed something much simpler. There's one electrical fluid, and it's in everything. Rubbing doesn't create it, rubbing moves it. One object ends up with a surplus, the other with a deficit. And he named those 2 states the way we still name them today: positive, negative. Charge is never created or destroyed, only moved around. That's conservation of charge, and it's still true. And he got there with glass tubes, cork balls, silk thread, and stubbornness. He also gave us battery, conductor, charge, and electric shock as technical terms. He didn't just do the science, he wrote the vocabulary you use. Then he started testing what conducts. He found a sharply pointed piece of metal would draw a charge off silently at a distance, where a blunt one had to be brought close enough to spark. He found a grounded body wouldn't hold a charge at all. Remember the pointed metal. That's the whole thing. He worked on the Leyden jar, the strange new device that could store a shock. Everyone assumed the electricity lived in the water inside. Franklin took one apart, poured the water into a second jar, and proved the charge stayed in the glass. Then, since one jar could only hold so much, he wired several charge plates together to multiply it and called the arrangement a battery, by analogy with a row of cannon. He nearly killed himself more than once, by the way. He was setting up to electrocute a turkey for a dinner party and took the full discharge of 2 large jars through his own body. Knocked him flat, left him shaking all evening. He reported it with mild embarrassment and noted that he'd meant to kill a turkey and had nearly killed a fool. And then, in 1749, he sat down and made a list. Lightning and electrical sparks, he wrote, have at least a dozen properties in common. Both give light of the same color, both travel in crooked lines, both are conducted by metals, both make a crack or a noise, both kill animals, both melt metal, both set flammable things on fire, both reverse magnets, both smell of sulfur. And then he writes the line that changes everything. The electric fluid is attracted by points. We do not know whether this property is in lightning, but since they agree in all the particulars wherein we can already compare them, is it not probable they agree likewise in this? Let the experiment be made. That's a man proposing to test whether the wrath of God is a natural phenomenon. In 1749, in a Protestant colony, he described the apparatus. An insulated iron rod up on a high tower, a man inside a sentry box to draw sparks off it when a thundercloud passes. Sent it to London, where some Royal Society members reportedly laughed at him. It got published anyway in 1751, translated into French, and read at court. May 1752. Village of Marly-la-Ville, outside Paris. A naturalist named Dalabar sets up a 40-foot iron rod exactly as described. He's away when the storm comes, so an old dragoon stands out in the rain and draws sparks from it, then sends the local priest running to confirm it. They repeat it for King Louis XV, who is delighted. The lightning in the sky and the spark in the laboratory are the same thing, and a shopkeeper from Philadelphia said so first. Franklin, who hadn't heard yet, ran his own version that June, the famous one. Silk kite, sharp wire at the top, key on the string, and a length of dry silk ribbon held under a shed door so the man holding it stays insulated. He waits until the twine goes fuzzy, brings his knuckle near the key. Spark. He had, in a phrase people started using almost immediately, stolen fire from heaven. And here's the part I want you to sit with. Unlike almost every celebrity scientist since, he turned it straight into a public good and refused to patent it. If lightning is electricity, and points bleed electricity off harmlessly, then a pointed iron rod on a roof, grounded into the earth, sends the strike into the ground instead of through the building. The lightning rod. And churches, which were the tallest and most frequently struck buildings in every town, and whose bell ringers were regularly killed trying to ring storms away, started surviving. He could have owned that. He gave it away. The honors came in a flood. The Royal Society, the same one that had chuckled at him, gave him its Copley Medal in 1753. Highest scientific honor in Britain. First time it ever went to someone outside Great Britain. Harvard and Yale, the university he never attended and its rival, both handed him honorary degrees the same year. In St. Andrews made him a Doctor of Laws, which is why the world starts calling him Dr. Franklin. A title from a man with 10 years of schooling between all of them. Oxford followed in 1762, and he kept inventing, and kept refusing to profit. The Franklin stove, which pulled more heat into the room and less up the chimney. Bifocals, because he was sick of carrying 2 pairs of glasses. A flexible catheter made of hinged silver segments designed for his brother John, who was suffering from bladder stones. That one might be the kindest invention in the history of medicine. The glass harmonica, a set of nested spinning glass bowls played with wet fingers, which both Mozart and Beethoven wrote music for. Swim fins, at 11 years old. And on his endless Atlantic crossings, he did something nobody had bothered to do. He asked the Nantucket whaling captains why the mail packets from England took 2 weeks longer than the merchant ships. They told him there's a river of warm water running through the ocean. and that English captains flatly refused to be told their business by American fishermen. So Franklin took temperature readings twice a day, plotted the current, and printed a chart of what we now call the Gulf Stream. At this point, he is the most famous man in the English-speaking world who has never held high office. That's about to change, and it's going to cost him more than he can possibly imagine. To understand what happens next, you need one piece of Pennsylvania's plumbing, and it's genuinely strange. Pennsylvania wasn't a royal colony. It was private property. William Penn had been granted the whole thing outright, and by the 1750s it belonged to his sons. Mainly Thomas Penn, who lived comfortably in England, had abandoned his father's Quaker faith and owned millions of American acres, which he insisted could not be taxed by the people living on them. Meanwhile, the Assembly, run by Quakers who wouldn't vote for weapons on religious principle, was staring at a frontier that was on fire. Britain and France had fought over this continent through 4 wars in 60 years, and every one of them meant raids on farms out west. So settlers are being killed while the government argues about whether the landlord's fields can be taxed to pay for a militia. In 1747, Franklin ran out of patience and went around the government entirely. He wrote a pamphlet called Plain Truth, laying out exactly what happens if a French privateer sails up the Delaware and there's nobody to stop it. Then he proposed a voluntary defense association, citizens arming and organizing themselves. And he added one detail that was close to insane. The men would elect their own officers, not appointed by wealth, not appointed by connections. A vote. 10,000 men signed up. Franklin ran a lottery to buy cannon, and when Pennsylvania couldn't supply them, he went to New York and talked that governor out of 18 guns over what he described as a series of increasingly friendly dinners. The militia never fired a shot in anger. Doesn't matter. That wasn't the point. The point is that a colonial population just found out it could organize its own defense without asking London for permission. And Thomas Penn understood exactly what he'd watched happen. He wrote that Franklin was a dangerous man of a very uneasy spirit, and that this was little less than treason. From that moment, those two are enemies. And that feud defines the next 20 years of Franklin's life. He's made joint deputy postmaster general for all of North America, and he tears the system apart and rebuilds it, surveys the roads himself with an odometer he built, runs riders through the night, cuts the New York to Philadelphia mail from weeks down to a day and a half. First time the colonies are physically connected as one network. Remember that, too. Then June 1754. War is about to break out in earnest, and London orders the colonies to send delegates to Albany to shore up the alliance with the Iroquois and coordinate defense. Franklin goes. And on the road up, he writes a plan. The Albany Plan of Union. A grand council with delegates from every colony, apportioned by what each one contributes, with real authority over defense and Western settlement, headed by a president general appointed by the Crown. Not independence. The opposite of independence. One American body inside the empire, strong enough to defend itself. And to sell it, he printed something in his Gazette on the 9th of May, 1754. A snake chopped into 8 segments labeled for the colonies. Above it, 3 words: join or die. One of the first political cartoons in American history, and 20 years later, people are still reprinting it, for a purpose he absolutely did not intend. The Albany Congress adopted his plan unanimously. Then every single colonial assembly rejected it, because not one of them would give up a scrap of authority. And London rejected it too, because a united America was precisely what the Board of Trade did not want. Decades later, Franklin was still convinced they'd all made a catastrophic mistake. If that plan had passed, he wrote, the colonies could have defended themselves. No need for British troops, no need for taxes to pay for those troops, and the bloody separation that followed might never have happened. Think about that for a second. The revolution might have been prevented by a committee, and the committee said no. The war came anyway, and it went badly. General Braddock arrived in 1755 to march west, found the colonies would give him almost nothing, and was openly contemptuous about it. Franklin, trying to be helpful in a way he regretted immediately, assured him Pennsylvania farmers would supply wagons, and then discovered that this was now his personal problem. So he rode the backcountry, cajoling German farmers, and finally pledged his own credit as security and produced 150 wagons. Braddock marched, got ambushed, and was killed. The wagons were destroyed. The farmers came to Franklin for their money. He was staring at claims that would have wiped him out several times over, and only the intervention of Braddock's successor, who eventually got the crown to pay, saved him from ruin. Meanwhile, the Assembly begged Thomas Penn one more time to let his lands be taxed for defense. He refused, then offered a lump gift instead, carefully framed so nobody could ever mistake it for a tax. And it's out of that exact fight that Franklin wrote the sentence people still throw at each other today. Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. He wasn't talking about airport security. He was talking about a landlord who wouldn't pay to defend the people living on his own land. With money finally moving, the Assembly revived his militia bill. Franklin put on a uniform and spent his 50th birthday in a frontier camp with his son William, building a stockade in freezing rain. His regiment elected him colonel. You found the whole thing embarrassing, especially when the officers turned out to escort him through the streets with drawn swords. Thomas Penn found it intolerable, because a printer with an armed following is a threat, so Franklin resigned the commission. And the Assembly found him a different job. Go to London, be our agent. Make the Penns pay their share, and if they won't, go over their heads. He sailed in June 1757 with William beside him, expecting to be gone a year. He'd be there, on and off, for 18. Franklin arrives in London and does not rush to the negotiating table. He takes rooms on Craven Street and sets about doing what he does best, becoming known. And he's magnificent at it. Joins the Royal Society properly, joins the Club of Honest Whigs, makes friendships that last the rest of his life. The physician, John Fothergill, the printer, William Strain, Joseph Priestley, who'd later isolate oxygen, and who wrote his History of Electricity largely because Franklin kept encouraging him. On summer travels, he meets David Hume and Adam Smith. Then he goes to work, and it's a disaster. His first serious meeting is with Lord Granville, president of the Privy Council. And Granville explains to him, patiently, the way you'd explain something to a slow student, that the king's instructions to colonial governors are the law of the land in America, and that colonial assemblies exist to carry them out. Franklin was genuinely shaken by that. He'd spent his entire life believing the empire was a partnership of Englishmen, that a man in Philadelphia had exactly the rights of a man in Bristol. And he'd just been told by the government itself that Americans are subjects of a different and lesser kind. The meeting with the Penns in January 1758 was worse. Franklin argued the Assembly had the rights of a House of Commons. Thomas Penn replied that his father's charter had promised no such thing, that the settlers should have read the fine print, and then he laughed. Franklin wrote afterward that Penn's expression in that moment was one he'd seen on a low jockey selling a lame horse, and that his contempt for the man became impossible to hide. Penn got hold of that letter. Any hope of a settlement died right there. November 1758. The Penns formally refused to deal with Franklin at all. So Franklin changed the objective entirely. If the proprietors are the problem, remove the proprietors. Petition to take Pennsylvania away from the Penn family and hand it directly to the crown. Stop and appreciate that. The future revolutionaries' plan in 1759 is to ask the king to take more direct control. He did win real things, a court ruling that the proprietors' estates could be taxed, and a pamphlet arguing Britain should keep Canada at the coming peace rather than trade it back to France, because the future strength of the empire was in the growing American population, not in a few sugar islands. That argument won. Britain kept Canada, which means the map of North America is partly the work of a Philadelphia printer with a pen. He also quietly arranged for William to be appointed Royal Governor of New Jersey. which is a stunning piece of patronage for the illegitimate son of a colonial printer. And William, who'd inherited more from his father than either of them liked to admit, had by then produced an illegitimate son of his own, William Temple Franklin, whom his grandfather would eventually take in and raise. 3 generations, same pattern every time. Nobody in that family ever commented on it. Franklin got home in 1762 to find Pennsylvania angrier than he'd left it. Frontier settlers, convinced the Quaker government had left them to die, turned on the nearest available target, a small, peaceful, Christianized Conestoga community. December 1763, a mob from Paxton murdered them, including the ones a sheriff had locked in a workhouse for their protection. Then, several hundred armed men marched on Philadelphia to kill the native refugees sheltering there, and any official who got in the way. The government panicked, and Franklin, who held no military office and had no obligation to do anything, organized the city's defense, then rode out to meet the mob himself and talk them into going home. He wrote a furious pamphlet afterward, asked readers to imagine what these men would say about a people who murdered the defenseless for having the same skin color as an enemy, demanded prosecutions. Nobody was ever charged. Worse than that, the government kept paying bounties for scalps. The Assembly voted to send him back to London. He sailed in November 1764 with no idea that Parliament had already lit the fuse. London's reasoning was simple, and from London's side it wasn't unreasonable. Britain had just won an enormously expensive world war, partly to defend the American colonies. Now it had 10,000 troops in America and a mountain of debt. Let the Americans pay a share. March 1765. Parliament passes the Stamp Act, a tax stamp required on newspapers, pamphlets, legal documents, licenses, playing cards, dice. Franklin argued against it beforehand and lost, and then made the worst political misjudgment of his career. He decided the thing was law now and might as well be administered by decent men. So he recommended a friend as stamp distributor for Pennsylvania. He had catastrophically misread the temperature at home. America erupted. Distributors hanged in effigy, their houses gutted, and a crowd formed in Philadelphia with the specific intention of pulling down Franklin's brand new house on the theory that he'd sold them out. And here's where Deborah Reed, the girl who laughed at him in the doorway, earns her place in this story. She sent their daughter out of the city, had her brother bring guns, moved into a front room, and announced she would not leave her own house, that she had done nobody any injury, and that she would defend herself. Friends turned out in the street and the crowd broke up. She wrote to him about it afterward, almost casually. He was 3,000 miles away and could do nothing at all. But those riots did something nobody planned. Men in Massachusetts and Virginia who'd never thought of themselves as anything but Englishmen suddenly noticed they were all furious about the same thing at the same time. That's the first moment where the word American starts to feel like an identity instead of an address. And Franklin, to his enormous credit, read the room, reversed himself completely, and then did the single most useful thing any American did that year. 13th of February, 1766. He's called to the bar of the House of Commons and examined for 4 hours. Friends feed him easy questions, enemies try to trap him. And he is calm, plain, funny, and devastating. Will the Americans submit to a modified stamp tax? They will never submit to it. What was their temper toward Britain before 2066-3? The best in the world. And now? Very much altered. Then the exchange that got reprinted everywhere. If the act isn't repealed, what happens to American respect for Parliament? It is lessened and will be lessened. And what could compel obedience? No power, however great, can force men to change their opinions. Parliament repealed the Stamp Act weeks later. The testimony got printed as a pamphlet in England, America, and France, and it made him the most effective colonial spokesman alive. Georgia hired him. New Jersey hired him. Eventually, Massachusetts hired him. One man now speaks in London for 4 colonies. He'd bought about 15 months of peace. June 1767. Parliament comes back with the Townshend Acts. Duties on glass, paint, paper, tea. On the theory that the colonists had objected to internal taxes and would tolerate customs duties. They had not, and they did not. And now Franklin is in an impossible position that nearly destroys his reputation on both sides of the ocean. He keeps arguing for the middle. To the radicals in Boston, he starts looking like a man who's been in London too long and enjoyed it too much. To the British government, he's the most dangerous American in England. He wrote constantly, mostly anonymously, in the London press, trying to explain each side to the other. And when polite explanation failed, he reached for the weapon he'd been carrying since he was 16. Satire. He publishes Rules by Which a Great Empire May Be Reduced to a Small One, written as helpful advice to a minister who wants to lose his colonies. Begin with the remotest provinces, he advises, because a great empire, like a great cake, is most easily diminished at the edges. Quarter troops on them. Ignore their petitions. And when the injured come to the capital to complain, punish them with long delay, enormous expense, and a final judgment in favor of the oppressor. Same year, an edict by the King of Prussia. Written entirely in the voice of Frederick the Great, who observes that since Germans originally settled England, England is properly a Prussian colony. And therefore, he'll now levy duties on all English trade, forbid the English to make their own steel, and ship Prussian convicts over there for the improvement of the population. Every single measure was one Britain had actually imposed on America. Franklin let a house guest read it out loud at breakfast and watched the man go pale halfway through. They were brilliant. They were also read by a government in absolutely no mood for jokes, especially not after the 16th of December, 1773, when about 60 men in Mohawk disguise dumped 10,000 pounds of tea into Boston Harbor. And then, Franklin's own secret came out. Somebody in London had given him 6 letters, written years earlier by Thomas Hutchinson, the royal governor of Massachusetts. And in them, Hutchinson argued that there must be an abridgment of what are called English liberties in the colonies. Franklin sent them to Boston with strict instructions that they not be published. He believed they'd prove his whole point, that the oppression was coming from Americans lying to London, not from London itself. They were published immediately. Massachusetts exploded. A duel was fought in England between 2 men wrongly suspected of the leak, and Franklin had to publicly confess to stop a second one. 29th of January, 1774. He's summoned to a room in Whitehall Palace called the Cockpit, literally where Henry VIII used to watch cockfights. 35 members of the Privy Council attend. The room is packed with spectators who came for a show. For an hour, the Solicitor General tears into him, calls him a thief, the first mover of the whole conspiracy, says he's forfeited the character of a gentleman, and the Privy Council laughs out loud. Franklin stands absolutely still in a suit of spotted Manchester velvet and says nothing, not one word, for an hour. The next morning they strip him of the postmaster generalship he'd held for 21 years. He walked out of that room a different man. The empire he'd spent 17 years trying to hold together had just spat on him in public, and he finally understood there was nothing there worth saving. He kept the velvet suit. Years later, in France, he wore it exactly once more, the day he signed the treaty that brought the French fleet into the war against Britain. He tried quietly for another year, secret talks with Lord Chatham and the Howe brothers over chess games that everybody understood weren't really about chess. Sympathetic men, every one of them, and that one of them with the power to change a thing. And in the middle of all that, December 1774, Deborah died in Philadelphia of a stroke. They hadn't seen each other in over 10 years. She'd been asking him to come home for most of them. He'd always had one more piece of business. He sailed in March 1775. 69 years old, a widower, publicly disgraced, and finally certain of what he was. He spent the crossing taking the temperature of the ocean twice a day, refining his Gulf Stream chart. because of course he did. That's who he was. While he's at sea, on the 19th of April, 1775, British regulars march on Concord and get met on Lexington Green. The war starts before he lands. He comes ashore on the 5th of May. Next morning, Pennsylvania elects him to the Second Continental Congress. A 69-year-old who's been in the country less than 24 hours. And he takes his seat as the most radical man in the room. Some delegates were suspicious at first. He'd been in London a decade and nobody was quite sure whose side he was on. He answered that by being the hardest working man there. 10 committees. He organized gunpowder manufacture because America had almost none. He negotiated with native nations. They made him Postmaster General of the United Colonies, so he rebuilt from scratch the exact system they'd taken away from him. John Adams wrote to Abigail that Franklin does not hesitate at our boldest measures, but rather seems to think us too irresolute. And then there's William, his son, the boy he raised, the man he personally placed in the governor's chair of New Jersey. And he is still, publicly and firmly, the king's governor. They met that spring at an estate north of Philadelphia over a bottle of Madeira. William argued they should all stay out of it. Hold their positions. Let the thing burn itself out. Benjamin told him there was no middle ground left. That after what he'd seen in that room at Whitehall, the only end to this was independence. And that a man who takes no side has already chosen one. William told his father that if the Americans kept on this course, his beloved country would soon be in flames. They both left knowing. And it got worse. In 1776, William was arrested by New Jersey militia and imprisoned in Connecticut, part of that time in solitary. Genuinely harsh conditions. His wife died in New York while he was locked up, and they wouldn't let him go to her. He wrote to his father asking him to intervene. Franklin did not. Not then, and not for a long time. What he did do was take custody of William's teenage son, Temple, and keep him. Meanwhile, Congress was still hoping. July 1775. They send the olive branch petition straight to George III, blaming meddling ministers rather than the king, begging him to step in. Franklin thought it was useless and voted for it anyway. The king refused even to receive it. In August, he declared the colonies in open rebellion. Franklin was already miles ahead of them. That same July, he'd drafted Articles of Confederation and laid them in front of Congress. He'd pulled out his old Albany plan from 1754 and reshaped it for a country instead of an empire, with powers split between a general Congress and the individual colonies. Congress wasn't ready. His draft got tabled. The articles that eventually passed were far weaker than what he proposed, and that weakness nearly wrecked the country. We'll get there. By spring 1776, the mood had turned. No answer from the king. Reports of 30,000 troops and hired German soldiers on the way. And in January, a pamphlet had appeared called Common Sense by an unknown English immigrant named Thomas Paine, a man Franklin had personally recommended to Philadelphia 2 years earlier with a letter of introduction. Small world. It sold in the tens of thousands and made independence sayable out loud. June 1776. Congress appoints a committee of 5 to draft a declaration. Jefferson, Adams, Sherman, Livingston, Franklin. They met partly at Franklin's house. Jefferson, 33 years old and the best writer among them, got the pen. Partly because Adams himself admitted he was obnoxious and disliked, and partly because everyone knew that if Franklin wrote it, he'd hide a joke in it somewhere. Now, there's a famous story about this, and I want to be straight with you because I've told the popular version myself. The story goes that Jefferson originally wrote, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable," and Franklin struck it out and wrote, "self-evident." Sacred belongs to religion, self-evident belongs to geometry. 2 words, and the whole argument moves from what God has decreed to what any reasoning person can see for themselves. It's a beautiful story, it's in the best-selling biography, and the documentary evidence doesn't really support it. The editors of Jefferson's papers at Princeton have looked closely at that surviving rough draft, and the handwriting in that correction looks like Jefferson's own. Franklin did make edits to the draft, and this change is exactly the kind of thing he'd do, which is probably why the story stuck. But we can't hand him that one. What he definitely did was smaller and kinder. Jefferson was in visible agony watching Congress cut his prose to pieces, so Franklin leaned over and told him a story about a hatter designing a shop sign who let his friends edit it word by word until nothing was left but his name and a picture of a hat. 2nd of July, Congress votes for independence. And when they sign the engrossed copy that August, they're signing a full, notarized confession of treason. Which brings us right back to the room we started in. The old man, the aching hand, the signature. And then Congress hands him the hardest job of the entire war. America could not win alone. No navy, no money, no manufacturing, and an army that was losing. The only realistic road ran through Versailles. France, humiliated by Britain in the last war and hungry for payback. So in October 1776, Congress sends its most famous citizen to Paris to beg. 70 years old, in constant pain, sailing on a fast warship through waters swarming with British cruisers, knowing perfectly well that capture means a rope. He takes Temple, 16, and his other grandson, Benny, 7. He lands as the most celebrated man in Europe, the man who tamed lightning, the philosopher of the New World. And he understands instantly that this fame is his only real asset, so he uses it. With the instincts of a man who's been inventing personas since he was 16 and writing as a widow, the French court is drowning in powdered wigs, silk, swords, and ceremony. And Franklin walks in, wearing a plain brown coat, no wig at all over his thinning hair, spectacles on his nose, and a marten fur cap he'd picked up in Canada. Greatest costume choice in diplomatic history. I'm not joking. Because the French had spent 30 years reading Rousseau about natural virtue and the simple man uncorrupted by courts. And here he is, in the flesh, cracking jokes in bad French. Paris lost its mind. His face went on to snuff boxes, rings, medallions, candy boxes. He wrote to his daughter that his portrait had been reproduced so often that his face was as well known as the moon. He settled in the village of Passy, set up a private printing press, flirted outrageously with half the intelligent women in France, played chess badly and at enormous length, and hosted the best dinners in the country. His American colleagues were furious. The man appeared to do nothing but socialize. John Adams complained that Franklin's life was one continued round of dissipation, that he never rose before 10 and never came home before midnight. They had no idea what they were watching. Every salon was a lobbying session. Every dinner was intelligence gathering. He was building, one person at a time, a national mood in which supporting America became fashionable and then irreversible, for a monarchy that had every reason on earth to fear helping a republic overthrow a king. And behind the parties, the actual work. He handled the financing, prisoner exchanges, a constant stream of European officers demanding commissions. He quietly supported American privateers preying on British shipping. He printed propaganda on his own press at Passy, including a fake newspaper supplement with an invented but completely believable account of scalp bounties, designed to shift opinion inside Britain itself. And he did all of it while the delegation around him fell apart. Silas Deane got recalled in disgrace over tangled finances. Arthur Lee was eaten alive by paranoia, seeing conspiracies under every chair. And here's the bitter joke. One of Lee's accusations was correct. The delegation's own secretary, Edward Bancroft, Franklin's trusted friend, was a British spy, passing London their secrets in invisible ink left in a bottle in a hollow tree in the Tuileries. Nobody caught him. He wasn't exposed for over a century. Franklin's response to all of it was simply to behave so that no report could stick. Assume everything you write will be read by your enemies, and write nothing you'd be ashamed of. Then, December 77 года, the news arrives that changes the war. Burgoyne's entire army has surrendered at Saratoga, and Franklin plays it perfectly. He lets it be known that British peace commissioners are talking to him, that America might just reconcile with London and leave France with nothing. Vergennes, the French foreign minister, moved fast. 6th of February, 1778. France signs treaties of amity and commerce and of alliance with the United States, and Franklin wore his spotted Manchester velvet suit to the signing. The same one. The one he'd stood in, silent, while the Privy Council laughed at him. That alliance is the war. French money, French muskets, French officers, and above all, the French Navy. In 1779, Congress made him sole minister plenipotentiary, and for years he was effectively the entire American state abroad. Ambassador, banker, consul, and beggar-in-chief, writing letter after letter for one more loan, and getting them. 19th of October, 1781. A combined Franco-American force and a French fleet closed the trap at Yorktown. Britain had lost an army and the will to keep going. July 1782. A prime minister inclined to settle comes in, and serious negotiations begin. The American commission is Franklin, John Jay, John Adams, and later Henry Laurens, with Temple Franklin as secretary. Franklin is 76 and in real distress from gout and a bladder stone, and he sets the terms early. No peace without full independence, recognized first, not traded for. He also floated, completely straight-faced, the idea that Britain might hand over Canada as a gesture of goodwill. He didn't get it. He never expected to. That's what an opening position is for. There was one delicate problem. The treaty with France said neither party would negotiate separately. The Americans did anyway, and signed preliminary articles with Britain on the 30th of November, 1782. Terms far better than anyone expected. Independence. The Mississippi as the western boundary. Fishing rights off Newfoundland. Which left exactly one job that only Franklin could do. Explain to the French foreign minister that America had just broken its word, and keep the alliance anyway. Vergennes wrote him a cold letter about it, and Franklin's reply is a small masterpiece, so listen to the moves. He concedes the fault, frankly, says the Americans were guilty of neglecting a point of propriety rather than a bad faith, expresses his hope that this little misunderstanding won't ruin the great work, and then observes that the English flatter themselves they've already succeeded in dividing the two nations, and he'd hate for Vergennes to confirm them in that opinion. And then, in the same breath, he asks for another loan. He got it, 6 million livres. Vergennes grumbled that the Americans had used France rather ill, and let it go. 3rd of September, 1783. The Treaty of Paris. The United States exists in law. Franklin stayed 2 more years waiting for his replacement, a man named Thomas Jefferson, who, on arriving, was asked whether he'd come to replace Dr. Franklin, and answered that no one could replace him. He was merely his successor. Franklin left France in July 1785, carried in a litter that belonged to the Queen, because he could no longer stand a carriage on rough roads. Crowds saw him off in silence. He never came back. 79 years old when he got home, and there was one job left. Because the country he'd helped create was, by 1786, in a state that genuinely alarmed him, and it was exactly the state he'd been warning about since 1754. 13 states behaving like 13 countries, printing their own money, taxing each other's goods, ignoring a Congress that couldn't raise a shilling. Then debt-ridden farmers in western Massachusetts, led by a former Continental Army captain named Daniel Shays, took up arms and shut down the courts. It got put down, but the whole world had just watched the United States fail to defend itself against its own farmers. May 1787 года. Delegates gather in Philadelphia to fix the Articles of Confederation, and figure out very quickly that fixing isn't possible. They'll have to build something new. Franklin is 81, the oldest man there by 15 years, so ill that he's carried the few blocks to the State House in a sedan chair on the shoulders of prisoners from the local jail. It's his city, and the room is full of men who grew up reading his almanac, and he says almost nothing. That was on purpose. The man who used to win every argument in the room finally understood what that Quaker friend had told him 50 years earlier. The loudest man persuades nobody. So he spoke rarely, often had his remarks read aloud by another delegate because his voice was weak. And he steered the room by asking questions instead of making claims. Socratic method, picked up from a cheap edition of Xenophon he'd read as an apprentice, 60 years earlier, still paying off. He didn't get what he personally wanted, by the way. He wanted a single-chamber legislature, an executive council instead of a president, and unpaid officials. He lost on all of it. What he contributed was the will to compromise. When the convention deadlocked over representation, big states demanding proportional, small states demanding equal, and delegates were literally packing to leave, Franklin was among those pushing the arrangement that broke it. One house by population, one house by state. And he put it plainly. When a joiner wants to fit two boards together, he takes a little off both. That compromise is the United States Congress. That's it. That's where it comes from. And on the final day, the 17th of September, 1787, with delegates still hesitating, he had his speech read out loud. He starts by admitting there are several parts of this Constitution which he does not at present approve, but that he isn't sure he'll never approve them, because he has lived long enough to have often been obliged to change opinions he was once certain of. Then he notes, with a smile you can feel right through the page, that most men think themselves in possession of all truth, and that a certain French lady, in a dispute with her sister, once said she found nobody always in the right but herself. And then the close. I consent, sir, to this Constitution because I expect no better, and because I am not sure that it is not the best. And he asked every delegate who still had objections to doubt, just a little, his own infallibility, and sign. 39 of them did. For Franklin, compromise was never just the practical option. It was the moral one. Tolerance, humility, and respect for other people required it. There's one last story from that room, and it's the right one to leave you with. As the delegates were signing, Franklin looked at the carving on the back of Washington's chair, a sun sitting on the horizon. And he remarked to the men near him that painters had always found it difficult to tell a rising sun from a setting one, and that through all the dark months of that convention, he'd looked at it without being able to tell which it was. But now, he said, he had the happiness to know that it was a rising and not a setting sun. He had about 2.5 years left, and he spent them the way he'd spent every other stretch of his life, working on the thing in front of him. He was in serious pain, dosing himself with laudanum for the stone. He kept writing to friends across an ocean he'd crossed 8 times. He worked on his autobiography, the book that basically invented the American self-improvement genre, and never finished it. It stops in 1757, before almost everything in the second half of this video. And he took up one final cause, the one where his own record was worst. Franklin had owned enslaved people. He'd printed advertisements for slave sales in his newspaper for years. He'd made money from it. Full stop. No softening it. He started changing his mind in the 1750s after visiting a school for black children in Philadelphia and finding, as he wrote frankly, that his prejudice about their capacities had no foundation. And he accepted the presidency of the Pennsylvania Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery. And he published an address arguing that freeing a man who'd been held in bondage was only the beginning of the debt, that the society owed the freed the education, the training, and the support slavery had stolen from them, or freedom would be an empty word. And in February 1790, one of the last public acts of his life, he signed and sent a petition to the First Congress of the United States, asking it to devise means for removing the inconsistency of slavery from the character of the American people. and to step to the very verge of its power to discourage every species of traffic in human beings. Congress rejected it. A Georgia congressman got up and delivered a long defense of slavery, out of Scripture, on the floor, and Franklin, dying, could not resist one last shot. He published a letter under a fake name, claiming to be a 100-year-old speech by an Algerian potentate defending the enslavement of European Christians, using point for point exactly the congressman's arguments. Who would till our lands if we freed them? Are they not better off with us than in their own miserable countries? Does not our holy book permit it? It ran on the 23rd of March, 1790. It was the last thing he ever published. 84 years old, still doing the exact trick he invented as a 16-year-old apprentice, sliding an essay under a door in somebody else's voice. 3 weeks later, on the 17th of April, 1790, with his grandsons at the bedside, Benjamin Franklin died. Around 20,000 people came out for the funeral. Philadelphia had about 28,000 residents. Do that math. Most of the city stood in the street, in silence, as the procession moved to Christ Church burial ground, where he was laid beside Deborah. And walking together in front of the coffin, by his own long habit of donating to every one of them, came the clergy of every denomination in the city, Christian ministers and the rabbi of the Jewish congregation, side by side. That was the point of his whole life, walking down a street. In France, where they understood him, the National Assembly went into mourning for 3 days. A foreign commoner, honored by a body of nobles. Mirabeau stood up and said that the sage whom 2 worlds claim as their own belonged to the whole human race. So look at the distance covered here. A boy cutting wicks in a shed that stank of boiled fat, whose father couldn't afford to keep him in school past 10. A runaway walking into a strange city with 3 rolls of bread and no plan. A teenager who had to invent a fictional widow just to get a word into print. A young man robbed of 2 years by a governor's empty promise. A father who lost a 4-year-old to a decision he made himself and carried it for 54 years. An old man standing silent in Whitehall while the most powerful men in the empire laughed at him. And also, the man who named positive and negative charge, who built the first battery, who pulled lightning out of the sky and then refused to patent the thing that made buildings safe, who founded a library, a fire company, a hospital, a university, and a postal system, who signed the Declaration of Independence, the alliance with France, the Treaty of Paris, and the Constitution. The only person in history who signed all 4. And here's what I keep coming back to. He wasn't a prodigy. He wasn't born to anything. No patron who kept a promise. No fortune. No degree he didn't earn honorary at 50. He had exactly one advantage, and it's available to you right now for free. He assumed he was wrong about something every single day and went looking for what it was. That's the whole method. That's the little notebook with the grid of dots and the page worn through from erasing. That's errata, the printer's word for a mistake you fix in the next edition, applied to a human life. Where did I go wrong today? What do I fix tomorrow? 64 years of that turned a candlemaker's 15th child into the man whose face is still sitting in your wallet. So tell me in the comments which part of his life deserves a full video of its own. The science? The years in France, or the son he never forgave? And if you want more of these, subscribe. We've got a lot of people left to dig into. Thanks for watching.